I'm 75 years old now, and there are memories that fade like old photographs left in sunlight. But there's one night, one terrible, impossible night when I was 40, that remains as sharp and clear as broken glass in my mind. Some of you watching might think I'm just another old woman spinning tales, but I swear on my grandmother's grave, every word I'm about to tell you is true. It was October 13th, 1988. A Friday, though I didn't think about superstitions then. I was driving home from my sister's house in the mountains of West Virginia, a stretch of road so lonely that you could drive for 30 minutes without seeing another car. The autumn fog had rolled in thick that evening, turning my headlights into useless orbs that barely cut through the gray soup surrounding my little Honda Civic. I remember checking the clock on my dashboard. 11:47 p.m. I was tired, bone-deep tired from helping my sister pack up our mother's belongings. Mom had passed 3 months earlier, and we'd finally worked up the courage to sort through 60 years of memories crammed into her tiny mountain cabin. My hands still smelled like old books and lavender sachets, and my heart felt heavy with the weight of saying goodbye to pieces of a life well lived. The road curved sharply ahead, and that's when my engine started coughing. Not the gentle sputter of a car needing a tune-up, but violent, desperate gasps like something dying. The headlights flickered once, twice, then died completely. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder, my heart hammering against my ribs in the sudden darkness. I sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself this was just mechanical failure. Nothing more. But the silence outside was wrong, too complete, too heavy. Even the insects had stopped their nighttime symphony. I fumbled for my flashlight in the glove compartment, but when I clicked it on, nothing happened. Dead batteries, though I just replaced them that morning. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps on gravel approaching from behind my car. In that desolate place, miles from the nearest house, there should have been no one. But someone was walking toward me through the fog, and each footfall seemed to echo longer than it should have, as if the very air was holding its breath. I turned around in my seat, peering through the rear window, but the fog was like a gray curtain. The footsteps stopped directly behind my car. My mouth went dry and I could taste copper, the metallic flavor of pure fear. Then I saw him. He stepped out of the fog and into the weak glow of my taillights like an actor stepping onto a stage. Tall, impossibly tall, wearing a dark coat that seemed to absorb what little light there was. His face was pale, angular, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's, though there was no light to reflect. But it was his smile that made my blood turn to ice water. Too wide, too knowing, as if he'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. He walked around to my driver's side window with unhurried confidence. I should have locked the doors, should have tried to start the engine, should have done something other than sit there paralyzed like a rabbit caught in headlights. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only stare as he bent down and looked directly at me through the glass. His lips didn't move, but I heard his voice as clearly as if he were sitting in the passenger seat beside me. It was a voice like velvet dragged over broken glass, beautiful and terrible at the same time. He looked at me with those impossible eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul, smiled that horrible knowing smile and spoke my name. Not just my first name but my full name, including my maiden name that I hadn't used in 20 years and my childhood nickname that only my grandmother had ever called me. "Hello, Margaret Rose O'Sullivan," he said, though his lips never moved. "I've been waiting for you." To understand why that moment shattered me so completely, you need to know who I was before that October night. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in the supernatural. I was practical, rational, the kind of woman who kept detailed calendars and balanced checkbooks to the penny. At 40, I thought I had life figured out. I'd been married to Tom for 18 years by then. A good man who sold insurance and coached Little League on weekends. We had 2 children. Sarah, who was 16 and beautiful in that heartbreaking way teenage girls can be, and Michael, 14 and obsessed with baseball cards and comic books. We lived in a split-level house in Morgantown with a mortgage we could barely afford and dreams we were still chasing. But if I'm being honest with you, and I promised myself I would be completely honest in telling this story, my life felt smaller than I'd expected it to be. Not bad, just smaller. I worked part-time at the local library, surrounded by thousands of stories that were more exciting than my own. I loved my family fiercely, but sometimes I'd catch myself staring out the kitchen window while doing dishes, wondering if this was all there was going to be. Tom and I had been drifting apart in the way married couples sometimes do. Not fighting, just existing in parallel lines that rarely intersected except to discuss schedules and household repairs. We'd make love on Saturday nights with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd forgotten why they'd fallen in love in the first place, then lie awake staring at the ceiling, both of us pretending to sleep. I'd started having trouble sleeping months before that night. Not insomnia exactly, but a restless feeling that would creep over me after midnight. I'd lie there listening to Tom's gentle snoring, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite catch. Sometimes I'd get up and walk through our quiet house, checking locks I'd already checked, straightening things that were already straight. My mother's death that July had shaken me more than I'd expected. She'd lived a full 83 years, died peacefully in her sleep, so there was no tragedy to rage against. But her passing had awakened something in me, a kind of existential terror I'd never felt before. If she could simply cease to exist, what did that mean for the rest of us? What did any of it mean? I remember standing in her empty cabin that afternoon before I drove home, holding one of her old prayer books. Mom had been deeply religious, the kind of Catholic who attended daily mass and kept holy water in a bottle by her bedside. I'd lost that faith somewhere in my 20s, trading Sunday services for Sunday brunches, but holding her prayer book made me wonder if I'd given up something precious without realizing it. "Are you watching over us, Mom?" I'd whispered to the empty room, feeling foolish but hoping for some sign, some comfort. The only answer was the sound of wind through the old window frames and the settling of wood that had seen too many seasons. I'd driven away from that cabin feeling like I was carrying invisible weight, some burden I couldn't name. The winding mountain roads that had enchanted me as a child now seemed ominous, full of shadows that reached too far and curves that hid too much. Every mile between my mother's house and home felt like I was traveling away from something I'd never get back. Tom had tried to comfort me in his gentle, practical way. "She lived a good life, Maggie," he'd said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "She wouldn't want you torturing yourself like this." He was right, of course. Mom would have told me to stop being so dramatic and go make myself useful. But knowing someone is right doesn't always make the feeling go away. The children had their own lives, their own concerns. Sarah was wrapped up in senior year drama and college applications. Michael was navigating the treacherous waters of freshman year in high school. They loved their grandmother, grieved in their own teenage ways, but they were looking forward, not backward. That's how it should be, I told myself. But it left me feeling isolated in my grief, like I was the only one standing guard over memories everyone else was ready to release. I'd started taking longer routes home from work, driving through neighborhoods I'd never explored, as if I might discover something that would explain the restlessness growing inside me. Sometimes I'd park at the overlook above town and stare down at all the lit windows, wondering about the lives being lived behind them. Were those people happy? Did they feel this strange sense of waiting for something they couldn't name? That October evening, driving home from clearing out Mom's cabin, all these feelings had crystallized into something sharp and painful in my chest. I'd loaded my car with boxes of photographs, letters, and small treasures that had meant everything to her and nothing to anyone else. The weight of all those forgotten moments felt heavier than the physical boxes themselves. I should have stayed the night at my sister's house. She'd offered, seen how tired I looked, how the grief was wearing on me. But I'd insisted on driving home. Tom was expecting me and Michael had a game the next morning. I was always the responsible one, always putting everyone else's needs before my own comfort. If I'd accepted Linda's offer to stay, none of what happened next would have occurred. But I didn't stay. I drove into that fog-shrouded night carrying my mother's memories and my own restless sorrow, completely unprepared for the encounter that would change everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed in the weeks leading up to that night. At the time, I dismissed them as grief playing tricks on my mind, the natural result of stress and sleepless nights. But grief doesn't explain everything that happened, and I've had 35 years to think about the pattern I was too blind to see then. It started with the feeling of being watched. Not the casual awareness you get when someone glances at you in a store, but an intense, focused attention that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'd be shelving books at the library, and suddenly I'd have to turn around, certain someone was staring at me. But I'd find only empty aisles and the usual handful of patrons reading newspapers or helping their children find picture books. At home it was worse. I'd be cooking dinner or folding laundry, and I'd get the overwhelming sense that someone was outside our kitchen window, just beyond the reach of the porch light. I'd make excuses to walk through the house, checking locks and peering through curtains, but I never saw anything unusual. Just our quiet suburban street with its neat rows of houses and trimmed lawns. "You're jumpy lately," Tom observed one evening in early October. We were watching television, some sitcom that was supposed to be funny, but I kept looking toward the windows. "Maybe you should talk to Dr. Peterson about something for your nerves." I almost laughed. Dr. Peterson would have prescribed Valium and told me it was normal to feel anxious after losing a parent. But this wasn't normal anxiety. This was the bone-deep certainty that something was paying attention to me, studying me, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The dreams started around the same time. Not nightmares exactly, but strange, vivid dreams that left me feeling more tired when I woke up than when I'd gone to sleep. I'd dream I was walking through familiar places. My childhood home, the library where I worked, even my own house. But everything would be slightly wrong. Doors where there shouldn't be doors, hallways that stretched longer than they should, shadows that moved independently of their sources. In these dreams I was always searching for something, though I never knew what. I'd walk through endless rooms, opening doors and calling out, but no one ever answered. The worst part was the sound of footsteps following me, always just around the corner or behind the door I'd just closed. I'd wake up with my heart pounding, Tom sleeping peacefully beside me, and I'd lie there trying to convince myself it was just my subconscious processing grief. But then strange things started happening when I was fully awake. Books would be moved at the library. Not dramatically. I wasn't finding religious texts in the fiction section or anything like that. But books I'd shelved would be pulled forward slightly, as if someone had been examining them. Always books about death, loss, or the supernatural. I'd push them back into place, thinking perhaps a patron had been browsing, but it happened too often to be coincidence. At home I'd find cabinet doors standing slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd closed them. The thermostat would be adjusted by a degree or two, nothing dramatic but enough to make me notice. Small objects would be moved. My reading glasses relocated from the nightstand to the kitchen counter, car keys on the wrong hook by the door. "Mom, did you move my baseball cards?" Michael asked one morning before school. I found them arranged in a perfect circle on his bedroom floor, each card face up and precisely aligned. He claimed he'd left them in their box on his desk the night before. "Maybe you arranged them and forgot," I suggested, but even I didn't believe it. The pattern was too deliberate, too careful. Someone had taken time to create that circle, but none of us remembered doing it. Sarah started complaining about her room feeling cold, even though the heat was working fine everywhere else in the house. She'd come downstairs in the morning wrapped in extra sweaters, claiming her room had been freezing all night. When Tom checked the vents and the thermostat, everything seemed normal, but Sarah's room remained uncomfortably cold. The phone calls began 2 weeks before that October night. Always at odd hours, very early morning or late evening, and always the same thing. I'd answer, say hello, and hear nothing but silence on the other end. Not the silence of a wrong number or telemarketer giving up, but an active, listening silence. Someone was there, breathing quietly, waiting. After 30 seconds or so, they'd hang up without saying a word. "Probably teenagers playing pranks," Tom said when I mentioned it. Or someone with a wrong number who's too embarrassed to speak up. But the calls came too regularly, always when I was alone in the house, as if whoever was calling knew exactly when to reach me without witnesses. The most unsettling incident happened 3 days before I drove to Mom's cabin. I was alone in the library, staying late to finish inventory, when I heard someone walking around upstairs in the children's section. Slow, measured footsteps that seemed to pace back and forth between the stacks. The library was officially closed and I'd locked the front door myself, but someone was definitely up there. I called out, thinking perhaps another staff member had stayed late, but got no response. The footsteps continued, unhurried and deliberate. I climbed the stairs with my heart hammering, expecting to find an intruder or maybe a patron who'd hidden until closing time. But the children's section was empty, chairs pushed neatly under tables, books in perfect order on the shelves. I checked every corner, every possible hiding place, but found nothing. Yet as I stood there in the silence, I had the absolute certainty that I wasn't alone. Someone was watching me from somewhere I couldn't see, and they were enjoying my confusion and growing fear. I left the library that night feeling like I was being followed, though I never saw anyone behind me. I drove home taking random turns, checking my rearview mirror obsessively, but the streets were empty. Still, the feeling persisted all the way to my driveway, and I sat in my car for 5 full minutes, scanning the shadows around our house before I felt safe enough to go inside. That night, I dreamed about standing in a fog so thick I couldn't see my own hands. I could hear someone calling my name from far away, but the voice seemed to come from all directions at once. I tried to follow it, but every step I took seemed to lead me further into the gray emptiness. I woke up with the taste of mist in my mouth and the certain knowledge that something was coming for me soon. 3 days later, I drove to my mother's cabin for the last time, carrying boxes of memories and a growing sense of dread I couldn't shake. If I'd been braver or smarter or more willing to trust my instincts, I might have recognized these signs for what they were: preparations for an encounter that would change everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. But I dismissed them all as grief and stress, right up until the moment my car died on that lonely mountain road and I heard footsteps approaching through the fog. When he spoke my name, my full name including details no stranger should have known, time seemed to stop. I sat frozen in my car, staring at this impossible figure through the glass, my rational mind scrambling for explanations that simply didn't exist. He couldn't be real. People don't just appear out of fog on empty mountain roads. But there he was, solid and undeniable, looking at me with those reflective eyes that seemed to hold depths I couldn't fathom. "Margaret Rose O'Sullivan," he said again, and this time I heard something like affection in that velvet over glass voice. "Though everyone calls you Maggie now, don't they? Except your husband, who still uses the pet name he gave you in college. Maggie May, after the Rod Stewart song. And your mother, God rest her soul, she always called you Rosie because you reminded her of the wild roses that grew behind her childhood home." My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't have started the car even if the engine would turn over. No one knew those details. Not all of them, not assembled like that. My mother had never told anyone else about calling me Rosie, and Tom's pet name was something private between us, something we'd kept even through the rough patches in our marriage. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though I'm not sure he could have heard me through the glass. But somehow he did. "I think you know," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Deep down, in that part of you that still remembers being afraid of the dark, you know exactly who I am. I'm the shadow at the edge of your vision, the whisper you can't quite hear, the cold breath on your neck when you're alone. I'm the answer to questions you've been asking without realizing it." He reached out and placed his palm flat against my window. His hand was long-fingered and pale, but it cast no reflection in the glass. Where his skin touched the window, frost began to spread in delicate patterns, like winter capturing summer in crystalline webs. "You've been calling to me," he continued, his voice somehow reaching me despite the barrier between us. "Every sleepless night, every moment you've stood at your kitchen window wondering if this is all there is, every time you've looked at your family and felt like a stranger in your own life. You've been sending out signals, Margaret Rose, whether you know it or not." "That's not true," I said, finding my voice, though it sounded thin and frightened even to my own ears. "I never called for anything. I just want to go home." He smiled then, and it was the most beautiful and terrible thing I'd ever seen. "Home," he repeated like he was tasting the word. "But which home do you mean? The house where you sleep next to a man who's become a stranger? The childhood you can never return to? The future you're afraid to face? Or perhaps you mean the home you've never found, the place where you truly belong?" The frost on my window was spreading, creating intricate patterns that looked almost like words in a language I couldn't read. I could feel the cold seeping through the glass, though that should have been impossible. My breath began to mist in the air inside the car, and I realized the temperature was dropping rapidly. "I know you, Margaret Rose O'Sullivan," he said, leaning closer to the window. "I know that you lie awake at night wondering what would have happened if you'd made different choices. I know you sometimes stand in your shower and cry for reasons you can't name. I know you picked up that prayer book in your mother's cabin and asked for a sign, any sign, that there was more to existence than the small circle of your daily routine." He was right, and that terrified me more than his impossible appearance or the supernatural cold spreading through my car. He was describing feelings I'd never shared with anyone, thoughts I'd barely admitted to myself. How could he know these things? "You're grieving more than your mother's death," he continued, his voice growing softer, almost gentle. "You're grieving the life you thought you'd have, the person you thought you'd become. You're 40 years old and you feel like you're disappearing a little more each day, fading into the background of everyone else's story." Tears started streaming down my face, though I didn't remember starting to cry. Everything he said was true, painfully, precisely true. I had been disappearing, becoming smaller and quieter, more careful and less alive with each passing year. I'd built a life that looked good from the outside but felt empty from within. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked through my tears. "What do you want from me?" "Want?" He seemed to consider the question, his head tilting the other way like a predator examining prey. "I want to offer you something, Margaret Rose. I want to give you the chance to be seen, to be known, to matter in ways you've never imagined. I want to show you what it feels like to be truly alive." The frost on my window had covered the entire surface now, creating a barrier of ice between us, but I could still see his eyes burning through it like twin stars. "All you have to do is open the door," he said. "Step out of that car, out of that small, safe life, and I'll show you wonders beyond your imagination. I'll make you feel things you've forgotten you could feel." "And if I don't?" I whispered. His smile widened, showing teeth that were too white, too sharp. "Then you drive home to your split-level house in your parallel life, and you spend the next 35 years wondering what would have happened if you'd been brave enough to take my hand. You'll grow old and gray and tired, watching your children build their own small lives, and you'll die having never really lived at all." The terrible thing was how tempting his offer sounded. Part of me, a part I'd been trying to ignore for months, wanted to open that door. Wanted to step out into the unknown and see what he promised to show me. I was so tired of being careful, so exhausted by the weight of other people's expectations and my own fear of disappointing them. But another part of me, the part that remembered my children's laughter and Tom's gentle hands and my mother's prayers, recoiled from him. This thing, whatever he was, didn't want to save me from my small life. He wanted to destroy it and me along with it. "I know what you are," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "And I know what you're offering isn't real. It's just another kind of death." For the first time his expression changed. The predatory smile faded, replaced by something that might have been respect or disappointment or perhaps both. "You're stronger than I expected," he admitted. "Most people in your situation would have opened that door by now." The frost on my window began to recede, melting away in rivulets that looked like tears. The cold in the car dissipated and I could feel warmth returning to my fingers and toes. But he didn't disappear. He remained there, watching me with those impossible eyes. "This isn't over, Margaret Rose," he said, straightening up. "I'll be watching you, waiting for the next time you feel lost and alone and forgotten. Everyone has moments of weakness, times when the safe choice feels like a prison. When that time comes again, and it will, remember this moment. Remember that I offered you a way out." He stepped back from my car and the fog began to swirl around him like a living thing. "Until we meet again," he said, his voice already growing distant. "And we will meet again." Then he was gone, vanished into the mist as suddenly as he'd appeared. My car engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. The headlights blazed bright and clear, cutting through the fog that was already beginning to dissipate. I sat there for a long moment, hands trembling on the steering wheel, wondering if I'd just escaped something terrible or lost the chance for something extraordinary. The digital clock on my dashboard read 11:47 p.m., the exact same time it had shown when my car first died. No time had passed at all, though our conversation had felt like hours. I put the car in drive and headed home through rapidly clearing air, carrying with me the memory of eyes that reflected light that wasn't there and a voice that knew secrets I'd never told. I never mentioned what happened to anyone. How could I? But I carried the weight of that encounter with me every day afterward, wondering if I'd made the right choice and terrified that someday I might have to make it again. The first thing I did when I got home that night was stand in my driveway for 10 minutes, staring at my house like I'd never seen it before. The porch light cast its familiar yellow glow over the front steps, the same light that had welcomed me home thousands of times before. But something felt different. I felt different, like I'd crossed an invisible line and could never quite find my way back to the person I'd been before. Tom was asleep when I slipped into bed beside him, but he stirred when the mattress shifted under my weight. "How did it go at your mother's?" he mumbled, not really awake. "Fine," I whispered, though nothing about it had been fine. "Just tired." He made a soft sound of acknowledgement and rolled back toward his side of the bed. I lay there in the darkness, listening to his breathing return to the steady rhythm of sleep, and wondered how I was supposed to pretend that nothing had happened. How do you go back to discussing grocery lists and soccer schedules when you've just met something that claimed to know the deepest corners of your soul? Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those reflective eyes staring back at me, heard that voice speaking my name with impossible familiarity. I kept getting up to check the windows, to peer through the curtains at our quiet street, half expecting to see a tall figure standing under the streetlight, waiting. The next morning brought the cruel normalcy of Saturday routine. Michael's baseball game, grocery shopping, household chores that had to be done regardless of supernatural encounters. I moved through it all like an actress playing a role, saying the right words and making the appropriate expressions while my mind replayed every moment of the night before. "Mom, are you okay?" Sarah asked over breakfast. "You look weird." "Just tired, honey," I said, pouring orange juice with hands that barely trembled. I stayed up too late going through Grandma's things. But I wasn't just tired. I was fundamentally changed, marked by something I couldn't explain or forget. The ordinary world felt thin around the edges, like a stage set that might collapse if I pushed too hard against it. I found myself studying familiar things. My coffee mug, the kitchen wallpaper, Tom's profile as he read the newspaper, as if seeing them for the first time or perhaps the last. The next few days were worse. I couldn't concentrate at work, finding myself staring at the same page of a book for minutes at a time without reading a single word. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, asked if I was feeling well. I assured her I was fine, just working through some grief, but she looked at me with concern I hadn't seen before. Sleep became my enemy. When exhaustion finally pulled me under, I dreamed of fog and footsteps and voices calling my name from distances I couldn't measure. I'd wake up with the taste of mist in my mouth and the certainty that I'd been walking somewhere far from my bed, though I was always safely tucked under my covers when consciousness returned. Tom noticed my restlessness. "Maybe you should see someone," he suggested gently one evening after I'd gotten up for the fourth time to check the locks. "A counselor or something. Losing your mom has hit you harder than you expected." I almost laughed. What would a counselor say when I told them I'd met the devil on a mountain road? That he'd offered me escape from my small life in exchange for my soul, and that part of me had been tempted? They'd put me on medication or lock me away, and either option would mean never seeing my children again. "I'm fine," I said, the lie coming easier each time I told it. "Just need some time to adjust." But I wasn't adjusting. I was obsessing. Every spare moment was consumed with thoughts of that night, analyzing every word he'd spoken, every impossible detail of his appearance. I researched legends and folklore about devil encounters, driving to libraries in neighboring towns where no one would recognize me, searching for stories that might explain what had happened. I found plenty of stories. People throughout history claimed to have met Satan himself, usually at crossroads or isolated places, always offered bargains for their souls. But their accounts felt different from my experience, more theatrical, less personal. The figure they described was a tempter, a deceiver who promised wealth or power or love. My encounter had been more intimate than that, more knowing. He hadn't offered me riches or fame. He'd offered me the chance to be seen, to matter, to feel fully alive. And the terrible truth I couldn't admit to anyone was that his offer had been precisely what I'd been yearning for without realizing it. The phone call started again 2 weeks after that night. Same pattern as before. Silence on the other end, someone listening, breathing quietly, then hanging up without a word. But now I recognized something in that silence, a quality of attention that felt familiar. I began to dread the phone ringing, but I couldn't stop myself from answering. "Hello," I'd say, and the silence would stretch between us like a held breath. I never heard his voice again, but I knew it was him. He was keeping his promise to watch, to wait for moments of weakness. Each call was a reminder that our encounter wasn't finished, that he believed I would eventually change my mind about his offer. The worst part was that he might have been right. There were moments, standing at the kitchen sink at midnight, watching suburban houses with their lit windows and tidy lawns, feeling the weight of tomorrow's identical routine pressing down on me, when I found myself wondering what would have happened if I'd opened that car door. My relationship with Tom grew more strained. How could it not? I was keeping a secret so large it created distance between us even when we were in the same room. He'd try to make conversation about his day or plans for the weekend, and I'd respond appropriately, but my mind was always elsewhere, replaying that night, analyzing those words, trying to understand what I'd encountered and what it meant for the rest of my life. "You're disappearing on me, Maggie," he said one night as we lay in bed, both of us staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping. "I know you're grieving your mom, but this feels like more than that." It feels like you're going somewhere I can't follow." His words were too close to what I'd been feeling for me to offer comfort. I was disappearing, had been disappearing for months before that night on the mountain road. The encounter had simply made me aware of it, given it a name and a face and a voice that knew my secrets. "I'm right here," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. The children sensed something was wrong too. Michael became quieter around me, watching me with puzzled eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. Sarah started spending more time at friends' houses, coming home only for dinner and homework before disappearing again. I didn't blame them. I was becoming someone they didn't recognize, someone even I didn't recognize. 3 weeks after that October night, I was alone in the house when the phone rang at 11:47 p.m., the exact time my car had died on the mountain road. I stared at it for 6 rings before answering, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Hello," I whispered. The silence stretched longer than usual this time, filled with a presence I could almost feel through the phone line. Then just before he hung up, I heard something I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. A soft chuckle, barely audible, but unmistakably the sound of someone who knew exactly how much his attention was affecting me. The line went dead, leaving me standing in my kitchen at midnight, holding a silent phone and wondering how much longer I could pretend that my life hadn't been fundamentally altered by 6 words spoken through fog on a lonely mountain road. "Hello, Margaret Rose O'Sullivan. I've been waiting for you." I started going to church again 3 weeks after the encounter. Not our usual family church where Tom ushered and the children had been baptized, but a small Catholic church on the other side of town where I could slip in during weekday morning mass and remain anonymous among the handful of elderly parishioners who attended daily service. Father McKenna was older than my mother would have been, with gentle eyes and hands marked by decades of offering comfort to troubled souls. I'd sit in the back pew during his brief homilies, studying his face for signs that he'd encountered the kinds of questions I carried, the kinds of doubts that felt too dangerous to speak aloud. After Mass, I'd light candles and kneel before the statue of the Virgin Mary, trying to remember the prayers my mother had taught me as a child. But the words felt hollow in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd forgotten how to understand. Still, the ritual of it offered some comfort, the familiar sense of incense and old wood creating a buffer between me and the memory of that night. It took me 2 weeks to work up the courage to approach Father McKenna for confession. I hadn't been to confession in over 20 years, not since before my wedding, but I needed to tell someone what had happened. I needed to know if my soul was in danger, if I'd somehow invited evil into my life through my own restlessness and discontent. The confessional was smaller than I remembered, dark and intimate and smelling of furniture polish and decades of whispered secrets. I could see Father McKenna's profile through the screen between us, patient and still as he waited for me to begin. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," I began, the words coming back to me from childhood. It has been many years since my last confession. I told him about the night on the mountain road, leaving out nothing. The loneliness I'd been feeling, the restlessness, the encounter with something that claimed to know me better than I knew myself. I told him about the temptation I'd felt, the way part of me had wanted to open that car door and step into whatever he was offering. Father McKenna listened without interruption, his breathing steady and calm behind the partition. When I finished, the silence stretched so long I wondered if he'd fallen asleep or simply didn't believe me. "My child," he finally said, his voice careful and measured, "you've experienced something that tests the very foundations of faith. These encounters, they're not as uncommon as you might think. Throughout history, people have reported meetings with entities that challenge our understanding of good and evil, of choice and consequence. Do you think I'm going crazy?" I asked, the question I'd been afraid to voice even to myself. "No," he said firmly. "Madness feels different than what you've described. What you experienced was real in ways that matter more than physical evidence. The question isn't whether it happened but what you're meant to learn from it." He gave me penance, prayers I hadn't said since childhood, but more importantly, he gave me permission to believe my own experience. "Evil often appears most seductive when we're at our most vulnerable," he explained. "When we feel unseen, unvalued, forgotten. But you chose correctly even in your moment of greatest temptation. That tells me your soul is stronger than you realize." I left that confessional feeling lighter than I had in weeks, but Father McKenna's words also raised new questions. If such encounters were not uncommon, why didn't people talk about them? How many others carried similar secrets, similar burdens of knowledge they couldn't share. I began researching more systematically, spending hours in libraries and bookstores, reading everything I could find about supernatural encounters, religious experiences, and the psychology of belief. I read accounts of saints who'd wrestled with demons, ordinary people who'd claimed divine visions, researchers who'd studied the borderlands between faith and reason. Most interesting were the stories of people who'd encountered entities offering bargains or choices at crucial moments in their lives. These accounts spanned cultures and centuries, but they shared common elements. The entity always appeared when the person felt lost or desperate, always offered exactly what they thought they wanted most, and always demanded a price that seemed reasonable until examined closely. But I also found stories of people who'd refused such offers, who'd chosen their ordinary lives over supernatural promises. These accounts were rarer, less dramatic, often buried in footnotes or mentioned only in passing. The people who said no didn't become legends or cautionary tales. They simply returned to their lives, carrying the weight of their encounter in silence. That's when I realized I wasn't looking for answers about what I'd met that night. I was looking for permission to feel proud of the choice I'd made, validation that choosing my small, imperfect life over his grand promises had been an act of courage rather than cowardice. One afternoon, while researching in a library 3 towns over, I found a book of interviews with people who claimed to have had supernatural encounters. One story stopped me cold. A woman named Elena, now in her 70s, described meeting a figure on a deserted highway in 1962 when she was 35 and struggling with depression after her divorce. "He knew things about me no one else knew," she said in the interview. "My childhood nickname, the name I'd given my stillborn baby that I'd never told anyone. He offered me a new life, a chance to be someone important, to matter in ways I never had before." She'd refused, driven home, and spent the next 40 years wondering if she'd made the right choice. "I married again, had children, built a good life," she said. "But sometimes, especially when things got difficult, I'd wonder what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to take his hand." Reading her words was like looking in a mirror. Elena had carried the same questions, the same doubts, the same secret burden I was carrying. But she'd lived 40 years beyond her encounter, long enough to gain perspective I didn't yet have. "The important thing," she said at the end of her interview, "is that I chose to trust in the value of ordinary love, ordinary life, ordinary struggles. I chose to believe that being a good mother and wife and friend mattered more than being special or important or remembered. Looking back now, I know it was the right choice. But it took me decades to understand why." I photocopied that interview and carried it with me for weeks, reading it whenever doubt crept in, whenever I wondered if I'd been a coward rather than wise. Elena's story gave me something precious. The knowledge that I wasn't alone, that others had faced similar crossroads and lived to find meaning in the choice they'd made. But the research also revealed something troubling. In every account I found of people refusing supernatural offers, there was mention of continued contact. Phone calls, dreams, moments of sensing they were being watched. The entity didn't simply disappear after being refused. It waited, watched, returned during moments of weakness or crisis. "They're patient," Father McKenna explained when I brought this concern to him during my weekly visits. "Evil understands that a single moment of refusal doesn't end the conversation. It waits for the next crisis, the next moment of despair, the next time you question the value of the life you've chosen." "How long does it last?" I asked. "When does it end?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Perhaps it never ends entirely," he said finally. "Perhaps the test is learning to live with that knowledge, to choose goodness and love and ordinary grace over and over again, even when you're being reminded of other options." His answer terrified me, but it also felt true. I was going to carry this for the rest of my life. Not just the memory of that night, but the ongoing awareness that I'd been marked, noticed, catalogued as someone who might be persuaded under the right circumstances. But I was also beginning to understand something else. The encounter hadn't been a random temptation. It had been a mirror showing me truths about myself I'd been avoiding. My dissatisfaction with my life, my feeling of invisibility, my hunger for significance. These weren't sins or weaknesses. They were human longings that deserved attention and care. I couldn't change the fact that I'd met something impossible on a mountain road. But I could choose what to do with the knowledge it had given me about myself, about the gaps in my life that made me vulnerable to his offer. The question was, How do you rebuild a life you've been taking for granted? How do you find meaning in ordinary moments when you've been offered extraordinary alternatives? How do you choose contentment over ambition, love over recognition, presence over transcendence? I was about to discover that those questions would take a lifetime to answer, and that the answers would keep changing as I did. I'm 75 years old now, and I can count on one hand the number of nights I've slept without thinking about what happened on that mountain road 35 years ago. Not because the memory haunts me, though it did for many years, but because that encounter became the defining moment that shaped everything that came after. The phone calls stopped about 6 months later as suddenly as they'd begun. But I continued to sense his presence at key moments throughout my life, always during times of crisis or transition, always when I was most vulnerable to doubt about the choices I'd made. When Tom and I went through our rough patch in the early 90s, when his business failed and we nearly lost the house, when we could barely look at each other without fighting about money and blame and broken dreams, I felt those reflective eyes watching from the shadows of our bedroom. Not malevolent exactly, but waiting to see if I'd finally reached the breaking point where his offer would seem reasonable again. I held on to my marriage by remembering Elena's words about choosing ordinary love. Even when Tom and I felt like strangers, even when I wondered if we'd both be happier apart, I chose to trust in the value of commitment over the allure of starting fresh. We went to counseling, did the hard work of rebuilding trust and intimacy, and came out stronger on the other side. But I always wondered if I'd have had the courage to fight for us if I hadn't already faced a more dangerous temptation and learned to recognize its seductive voice. When Sarah was 23 and struggling with addiction, when she'd call at 3 in the morning from hospital emergency rooms or jail cells, I'd sometimes stand at my kitchen window afterward and feel that familiar presence in the darkness. Not offering to take away the pain this time, but reminding me that there were other ways to handle crushing worry and guilt. Ways that would make me feel powerful instead of helpless, important instead of ignored. Those were the hardest moments, when my child was destroying herself and I was powerless to save her. The temptation to escape my own helplessness, to choose significance over suffering, was almost overwhelming. But I'd learned to recognize that voice for what it was, not salvation but the opposite. Another form of abandonment. I stayed. I went to Al-Anon meetings and therapy sessions and learned to love my daughter without enabling her. I held space for her recovery when she was ready for it and held space for my own grief when she wasn't. It took 5 years, but Sarah got clean and stayed clean. She's a social worker now, helping other families navigate addiction, and she tells me my presence during her darkest years gave her something to return to when she was ready. I never told her about the times I almost chose to disappear into something that promised to make the pain stop. When Michael was deployed to Afghanistan in 2003, I'd lie awake calculating time zones, wondering if he was safe, feeling the weight of every minute I couldn't protect him. Those sleepless nights were full of shadows that moved, wrong whispers at the edge of hearing, reminders that I could choose not to feel this crushing anxiety about things beyond my control. But I'd learned by then that the entity who'd offered me escape 35 years ago wasn't trying to spare me pain. He was trying to spare me the growth that comes from surviving pain, the depth that comes from loving people more than you love your own comfort. Michael came home whole, married a teacher named Jennifer, and gave us 3 grandchildren who call me Gamma Rose, a name that connects me to my mother in ways that make me cry with gratitude. If I'd chosen differently that October night, I never would have lived to hear their laughter or feel their small hands in mine. Tom died 8 years ago, quietly in his sleep after 47 years of marriage. The morning I found him still and peaceful in our bed, I felt the familiar presence more strongly than I had in years. Not malevolent but patient, waiting to see how I'd handle this loss, this transition into a life I'd never imagined living alone. The grief was crushing, made worse by regret for all the times I'd taken him for granted, all the moments I'd been physically present but emotionally distant. But I chose to stay present for the mourning process, to let it change me rather than escape from it. I learned that grief is love with nowhere to go, and that carrying it is a privilege, not a burden. I volunteer at the library now, reading to children twice a week. Their faces remind me why I chose to stay in my ordinary life all those years ago. Not because it was easy or comfortable, but because it was real. These children exist because their parents and grandparents made similar choices to love and commit and endure. They're the proof that choosing presence over transcendence, love over power, creates something lasting and beautiful. But I'd be lying if I said the temptation ever completely disappeared. Even now, at 75, there are moments when I feel the weight of invisibility that comes with being an elderly woman in a youth-obsessed culture. When store clerks look through me, when my opinions are dismissed, when I feel like I'm disappearing by degrees, I sometimes remember that voice promising to make me matter, to make me seen. The difference is that I understand now what I didn't understand at 40. Mattering isn't about being seen by the world. It's about seeing the world clearly enough to love it anyway. It's about choosing to be present for other people's stories, other people's struggles, other people's small victories. I matter to Sarah's children when I bake cookies and listen to their problems. I matter to the library volunteers who depend on my institutional memory. I matter to the young mothers at Storytime who nod gratefully when I help their toddlers find books. These moments of mattering are quiet, unremarkable, invisible to anyone keeping score of importance. But they're real in ways that supernatural promises never could be. The entity I met that night offered me the chance to be special, to transcend the limitations of ordinary human experience. What I learned over the decades that followed is that ordinary human experience, in all its messiness and difficulty and small joys, is the only place where love can take root and grow. I chose love. I chose ordinary grace. I chose to trust that a life spent caring for other people, even imperfectly, matters more than an existence spent being remarkable for my own sake. And on my best days, I believe I chose correctly. I'm recording this story on a Tuesday afternoon in November, sitting in the same kitchen where I used to stand at midnight, wondering if my small life was enough. The wallpaper is different now. Sarah helped me redecorate after Tom died, but the view from the window is largely unchanged. Suburban houses with their tidy lawns, ordinary people living ordinary lives, creating meaning through the simple act of loving each other day after day. I never told anyone this story while Tom was alive. How could I explain that I'd met the devil and he'd known my name, that he'd offered me escape from the very life Tom and I had built together? It would have sounded like rejection, like proof that I'd never been fully present in our marriage. But Tom died knowing I loved him, knowing I'd chosen him and our life together over and over again, and that's what mattered. Sarah knows now. I told her 2 years ago, after she'd been sober for a decade and had enough distance from her own encounter with temptation to understand mine. She listened without judgment, asking only a few questions, and when I finished she said something that surprised me. "I'm glad you met him, Mom." Glad. I couldn't hide my shock. "Not glad it happened," she clarified, "but glad you told me. It helps me understand why you never gave up on me during the worst of my addiction. Most parents would have written me off, but you stayed. Now I know why. You'd already learned the difference between love and abandonment, between presence and escape." She was right, though I hadn't seen the connection so clearly before. My encounter with supernatural temptation had taught me to recognize the seductive voice that promises relief from difficulty, the whisper that suggests pain can be avoided rather than transformed. When Sarah was destroying herself with drugs and alcohol, I heard that same voice suggesting I could choose not to feel the agony of watching my child suffer. But I'd already learned that choosing not to feel pain means choosing not to feel love, and love was the only thing I had to offer her. Michael still doesn't know, and I may never tell him. He's building his own life, making his own choices about what matters and what doesn't. But I watch him with his children and see the same qualities that made me refuse that otherworldly offer. Loyalty, commitment, the willingness to show up for people even when it's difficult. These qualities aren't dramatic or remarkable, but they're the foundation of everything good in human experience. I think about Elena often, the woman whose interview gave me comfort during my darkest period of doubt. She's gone now. I found her obituary 3 years ago. But her words about choosing ordinary love over extraordinary promises continued to guide me long after I stopped needing them daily. I hope my story might do the same for someone else who's faced impossible choices and wondered if they chose correctly. Because here's what I've learned in 35 years of living with the memory of that October night. The entity I met wasn't lying when he said I was disappearing, that I felt invisible and unimportant. Those feelings were real and they deserved attention. But his solution, transcendence, escape, supernatural significance, would have been another form of disappearing, more complete and permanent than anything I feared about my ordinary life. Real transformation doesn't come from escaping human limitations. It comes from embracing them fully, finding meaning within constraints rather than beyond them. It comes from choosing to love people and places and moments that won't last forever, precisely because they won't last forever. I spent decades wondering if I'd been a coward that night, if I'd chosen safety over courage, conformity over authenticity. But I understand now that staying requires a different kind of courage than leaving. It takes bravery to commit to people and places and purposes when you know they'll disappoint you sometimes. It takes strength to find meaning in repetition, beauty in routine, significance in service to others rather than service to your own desires for recognition. The devil knew my name because he'd been watching me struggle with questions every human being faces. Do I matter? Am I seen? Is this life I'm living worth the effort it requires? His answers to those questions were seductive because they promised to eliminate the uncertainty, to give me cosmic importance rather than domestic significance. But uncertainty is where love lives. In the space between knowing and not knowing, between comfort and risk, between the life you have and the life you imagine, there's room for choice. And choice, made daily in small moments, is where character is built and meaning is created. I chose uncertainty. I chose the difficulty of loving imperfect people in an imperfect world. I chose to believe that my ordinary life, with its struggles and disappointments and small joys, was sacred not because someone important was watching, but because I was participating in the ancient human project of caring for each other across time. The phone calls stopped decades ago, but I still feel watched sometimes, especially during moments of transition or loss. I don't think this ends until we do. I think the choice between love and escape, between presence and transcendence, between the difficult beauty of human connection and the hollow promise of individual significance, is one we face over and over throughout our lives. But each time I choose love, the choice gets easier. Each time I choose to stay present for life's difficulties rather than escaping into fantasies of being special or important, I get stronger. Each time I choose ordinary grace over extraordinary promises, I become more fully myself. Not the self that impresses others, but the self that loves reliably, shows up consistently, creates meaning through connection rather than achievement. I'm 75 years old and I know now what I couldn't have known at 40. I was never invisible. I was seen, by my children, my husband, my friends, my community, and by the sacred presence that exists in acts of love too small for anyone to notice or remember. That presence doesn't speak your name from the darkness or offer you escape from human limitations. It exists in the choice to make breakfast for people you love, to listen to friends' problems, to show up for life even when it's boring or painful or seemingly insignificant. I never told anyone this story until now because I was afraid people would think I was crazy or evil or somehow marked by darkness. But I'm telling it now because I want you to know. If you've ever felt invisible, unimportant, trapped in a life that feels too small for the largeness inside you, you're not alone. And if something ever offers you escape from that feeling, if a voice ever promises to make you special or significant or free from ordinary human constraints, remember this story. Remember that choosing love over significance, presence over transcendence, ordinary grace over extraordinary promises, is the most important decision you'll ever make. And you'll have to make it not once but every day in moments so small they seem meaningless until you realize they're everything. He knew my name and I will never forget his voice. But I chose the voices of people who love me as I am in the life I have, with all its limitations and possibilities. I chose the sacred ordinary, the holy mundane, the divine daily choice to show up for love even when love doesn't make you important. I chose correctly. And if you're facing a similar choice, I hope you'll choose correctly too. The phone is silent now. The shadows hold no whispers. I'm an old woman with an ordinary story of love and loss and the courage to stay present for both. But I'm here to tell it, and that means something. It means I chose life, chose love, chose the beautiful difficulty of being human. And 35 years later, I'm still grateful for the choice I made that October night when the devil knew my name, but I chose to remain Margaret Rose O'Sullivan. Wife, mother, grandmother, friend, reader of stories to children, keeper of ordinary grace. That's enough. That's everything.